Okay, so we're going to talk about bacteria, and remember your book puts them into two separate kingdoms. So we're going to talk about them as if they're one kingdom because it's kind of a debate among scientists. We're going to talk about kind of the good and the bad about bacteria, and we're going to be actually doing some stuff with this. So I know it's a lot of information, but I want to kind of roll through it. So in a single gram of soil, your book mentioned, or the reading that you did from your book, there are 2.5 billion bacteria or more. So that is a ton, right? So what are some characteristics of bacteria? And we're going to do this as we go through the different kingdoms. So right now we're on our first kingdom of bacteria. So they're the most numerous of living things, and they're so small that kind of makes sense. We can't even see them. We need a microscope to see them. So one of the things you have to remember is they are prokaryotic. Remember earlier this year we talked about how they are very simple, usually one-celled organisms. They don't have a nucleus. They don't have membranes around those cell parts, those organelles. And so they're very, very simple. Now, amazingly enough, some of them are producers. Some of them can photosynthesize like plants. And we're going to talk about that group called cyanobacteria. So some of them are what we call producers. They produce their own food, and some of them are decomposers. They break down dead organic matter and help keep our environment clean. And then others are what we call consumers like us. So they need other organisms to be able to survive. All right. So then your book showed a picture of the different shapes of bacteria. So I want you to take a look, and these are going to be helpful. So the bacilli are rod shaped, like a tall, kind of like a pole or a stick maybe. They have a large surface and they take in nutrients that way. But they can get dried out easily because they do have a lot to their surface. And remember, these are microscopic pictures, right? And the second group are called cocci. These are circular, right? And they don't dry out as quickly as the rod-shaped ones because they're more circular. And then the final group type of shape is what we call spirilla. So these are long and kind of spiral shaped. They should remind you a little of like DNA, but these guys use flagella at both ends. These are like whip-like tails to help them move. Now, earlier we talked about how cells reproduce. Now remember, these are simple, usually one-celled organisms. So they actually make an exact copy of themselves. So they are what we call asexual reproduction, right? So they divide in two and then you get new organisms. So look at how simple the cell division is. Remember, we talked about the complexity of mitosis earlier. Look at this. The cell grows, right? This is the DNA inside of it. It literally makes a copy of its DNA. We've talked about that. Then you start to see the cell divide. This is binary fission, and it just equally splits in two. So much more simple than, the stages and phases of mitosis that we talked about. So that's asexual, and most bacteria reproduce that way. Now, an amazing thing that bacteria have, you talk about evolution, they have what's called an endospore. So they can form this around themselves if the conditions are really harsh, like say it's super warm or super cold or super salty or intense. They can actually do this to be able to survive these extreme conditions. So bacteria are pretty resilient. And remember, I mentioned that bacteria are probably going to be what we see, scientists think, perhaps if we find life on other planets, because they are so resilient. And speaking of that, we have archaea bacteria, which are the sort of other group of bacteria. So we have the bacteria that cause diseases, right? Those are called eubacteria. And we have what are called archaea, and these are those ones that can live in the extreme conditions. So they love gases, they love salt, they love heat and cold. So you find them, look, in the oceans, in the hot springs, where you just don't find other life usually that is at the microscopic level. They're also found in Antarctica. So again, they are a little bit different than your normal eubacteria. A lot of bacteria have cell walls, even though we say only plants do, but some bacteria do. And they, you won't see these archaea having cell walls like other bacteria. So they're very different. So they're kind of important to take note of. So that's the first section that you read. And the second section, which I'd also like to go over right now, is kind of the good about bacteria in the world. So we sit here and we talk about how they're kind of gross and they cause disease and all of that. But amazingly enough, if it weren't for bacteria, we wouldn't have a lot of the foods that we have and such. So I want to talk about the good. So this was kind of the second part of your you're reading, right? So I want you to kind of think positively about bacteria right now. So they fix nitrogen. And what does that even mean to us? Well, plants need to have nitrogen, and the nitrogen that's in the soil has to be in a form that plants can use. So we have bacteria in the soil that literally fix the nitrogen so it's in a form that we can then, as plants, can use and be able to survive. And of course, we eat plants, so it's very important to us, right? So nitrogen fixation is an important job of bacteria. Recycling. Now, I bet you don't think about this, and it's kind of gross to imagine, but we see roadkill on the side of the road. We see different organisms and animals that pass away or die for different reasons, right? And they need to be composed and brought back into the soil and broken down. If they didn't, imagine how gross the environment would be. And I know it seems nasty to us, but bacteria do that job. So they break down the dead, the decaying matter, and they recycle it and provide really good soil for living things. So that is very, very important. We also have what's called bioremediation. Maybe you guys have heard about oil spills that happen in the ocean. They can actually use bacteria to eat up that oil, and they introduce it to be able to treat this hazardous condition of the oil spill or other types of hazards that happen in the environment, and they can use this to be able to clean the environment. So that's pretty amazing to think about. And then this is the one I was mentioning earlier. It's in our things like yogurt and milk and cheese and all of that. We need the bacteria to be able to help our own intestines in our body be healthy. So you need to have what we call good gut bacteria in your guts, right? In your stomach, in your intestines, that help you stay healthy. And so you might think that's weird, but we have what are called probiotics, and we have very good bacteria that live in yogurt and cheese and all of that help us be able to be healthy. So they are in our food. They're even in things like toothpaste, amazingly enough. Also, this is kind of crazy to think about, but we use bacteria to treat bacterial infections. So there's some infections that we have, like ear infections, or other types of things, and I'm just using a sample that we might have, right? And we use them in medications to kill other bacteria sometimes. So that's pretty amazing to think about, that they're a medicine that treats other bacteria. And then I don't know if you guys are familiar with insulin, but insulin is what your body needs to be able to break down sugar and carbohydrates. And if you don't have insulin, your pancreas and your body can't handle your blood sugar and things like that in your body healthy. So scientists have learned to use, for people who might be diabetic and need to inject insulin, we are trying to figure out how to make bacteria produce human insulin. And that is a very new thing that is kind of coming along. And so it might help people receive insulin whose pancreas doesn't make it themselves. So that might be an amazing option. And then we have genetic engineering, right? So scientists can use genes, right? The DNA codes, right, of bacteria to make products like cleaners and insecticides and adhesives or tapes that we would use in things like Band-Aids and all sorts of stuff. So it's pretty amazing. This is changing every day what we can do with it. So I want you to think in terms of, wow, bacteria can do some really good things. But also, of course, there are the ones that cause disease, and that's the group that we kind of spend our most time thinking about, right? So we'll address that as well. But basically, these are the ones that cause diseases like ear infection or other things that might be very, very bad for our body. And so we'll talk too about vaccines and antibiotics, right? So bacteria, if you have a bacterial infection and you go to the doctor will often give you an antibiotic that will treat a bacterial infection. We can also get what's called a vaccine. Now, a vaccine is only good if you don't have the disease yet. So you and I have been vaccinated against things that might be bacterial, but we'll talk about viruses too. And you can't get a vaccine if you already have the disease or the disorder. So that's important to know, but a vaccine prevents it. It gives you a little bit of that actual bacteria that's not going to harm your body, and it tricks your body into thinking, hey, I've already had this. So it makes what's called antibodies up against it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in person, but this is the basics of bacteria.